computer. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our breakfast, sort of more like brunch edition, student edition of our interdisciplinary research seminar series. Today we're having a very special event because it's student-led and because we get to hear about some of the dissertation work that students have been working on for almost a year, and in some cases have been thinking about for well over a year. So I think it's a lovely opportunity for us to hear about it and us to ask questions and to think about some themes that arise sort of across the different projects. And next week, I will just now flag up, we're going to have a poster competition. So everybody is invited to the poster competition. Everybody's invited to submit to the poster competition. But I didn't want to do a regular poster competition where you just make a poster quite literally and tack it on the board. So normally for a poster competition, you would make a poster, we'd hang it up, and we'd walk around and you'd stand by your poster. And as each person came by, you would tell people about what that poster is depicting. But we thought, why not go a little more creative since we can? So instead of, you can have a poster, which in this case would be a slide, but alternatively, I suggested you could do things like bake a cake that somehow says something about your dissertation, build something out of Lego. I actually took like a course on Lego as a form of pedagogy. You can do very cool things with Lego. That's all I have to say. One of my friends is a Lego, what is she? Not guru, not connoisseur, some kind of specialist. And she actually has it on her CV that she was like this, she had to go to London for a week to get this training and certificate. I was very jealous, I'm not gonna lie. But anyway, lots you can do with Lego, right? And you can use it to kind of, again, tell a story. You can, I sent out a link earlier, dance your dissertation. That's a thing, right? And make it like maybe a 1-minute video clip of you dancing and play it for us, or whatever. It's just a chance to have fun with it, right? The whole idea. But we also have a cash prize, so that makes it, you know, a little more enticing. We've got 35 pounds to give away. I really want to give away that money. We've got too much money, have to give it away. Please take our money, okay? Okay, so that's my little for next week. And now I'm going to suggest that each of our speakers talk for about 5 minutes. And if you get to be, let's say, going on 8 minutes, I'm gonna be like, okay. But what I'd like you to just talk about is, first of all, tell us what your project is. But I think what we want to hear about is your motivation, right? What inspired you to do this project? Was it a personal motivation? Was it more of an intellectual motivation? Were you reading things and saying like, why is there nothing about this thing that I'm actually really interested in? But also, why are you interested in it? Were there surprises along the way, right? Did you decide to interview people and then find that their responses were totally different from what you were expecting? What were some of the challenges that you faced? Did you want to interview people, but maybe people didn't want to be interviewed, right? So think about the kinds of things that cropped up along the way. And tell us, yeah, just like a bit more about your research process, right? What was that process like? Like, how did you also negotiate the sheer amount of reading involved in a project like this with like actually sitting on your chair and writing? So give us a little bit of a picture of what it's like to be doing this dissertation. And I guess as a final thing, since this is our interdisciplinary research seminar series, so we are an interdisciplinary program, I think it would be really nice if you talk about the interdisciplinary aspect of your project. And obviously for some will be bigger, some will be smaller. So that's my prompt today. We actually have 3 speakers. One had to drop out, unfortunately, but I think it's okay because also Katreya has to go at 12, and then we have an open day this afternoon, and I think it's fine. So we'll do an hour and get through everyone and get some questions. So please start thinking about questions as they speak. It's great to have questions that can kind of go across the speakers, but if you have questions for individual speakers, we're happy to take those as well. All right, so without further ado, Katie, would you like to tell us about your project? I'm going to mute myself.
Love to. So yes, thank you for organising this. So I don't actually have an official title yet, but essentially my dissertation is an epistemic analysis of what has come to be known as the veil debate in Western Europe. And by veil debate, I just mean the ongoing and emerging discussions about the permissibility of religious coverings and face veils, which is nearly always targeted at Muslim women in particular. And as I'm sure you know, this is increasingly relevant as countries in Europe continue to attempt to illegalize the wearing of the veil. So my main claim is that because of prejudicial assumptions about the trope of the veil in a Western contemporary secular context, specifically its naturalization to passivity, victimhood, oppression, repression, and increased likelihood of being coerced or manipulable, because of these associations, Muslim women who choose to veil may be more at risk of being ill-treated as epistemic agents, and specifically is more vulnerable to testimonial injustice, which is one form of epistemic injustice, which I'll come on to now. So what is epistemic injustice? Well, broadly, an epistemic injustice refers to the ways in which people may be wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. And it was coined by a philosopher called Miranda Fricker in 2007, and it has since become an emerging field in philosophy which looks at the relationship between truth, power, social situation, who we trust, etc. So according to Fricker, there are 2 types of epistemic injustice: hermeneutical and testimonial. Hermeneutical emerges when there is a gap in collective conceptual resources that makes it hard for a particular group of people to make sense of their experience. So Fricker uses the example of the term sexual harassment in the 70s, which provided an invaluable tool for women who were experiencing this phenomenon to attach their experiences to and then make sense of it. Sorry. Excuse me. And then the other form of epistemic injustice, and the one that my analysis relies on the most, is testimonial injustice. And testimonial injustice occurs when a speaker's testimony, so their expression or their speech act, is not afforded due credibility owing to prejudices on the hearer's part. So an example would be being less inclined to believe a female scientist because of prejudicial assumptions about women. Or one case study that I really like is explored by Javi Corral at Bristol, and that's of ill patients in the healthcare system who she thinks are particularly vulnerable to testimonial injustice from doctors because of the power, position, and prejudices about patients. So for Fricker, there are 2 components that make up the phenomenon of testimonial injustice, and that is the negative identity prejudice stereotype, which then leads to the conceptually tied credibility deficit. So I've almost in a way used these 2 components as my methodology. So the first chapter looks at the negative identity prejudice stereotypes of Muslim women in this context, owing specifically to the trope and perceptions of the veil. And then the following chapter I hope builds on this and frames it as constituting this specifically epistemic form of harm. So I look at some examples of the credibility deficit. And then my final chapter looks at some Muslim women artist self-expression, specifically through Shirin Nishat's Women of Allah series. And that offers contention with the two-dimensional narratives outlined in my first chapter. And I don't really have time to go into this now, but I also use this chapter and discussion to propose an additional variant of epistemic injustice, which I'm currently terming epistemic co-option, but I'm thinking of a more imaginative term. Yeah, so this was not my original point of departure for this research at all. I began looking at perceptions and meanings of the veil and the use of unveiling as a colonial tool and how that might be echoed with recent endeavours to ban the veil. But I quickly realised that this was a very large task and that there is extensive literature on this, and the veil is a symbol that is dramatically politicized and overburdened with competing symbolism, and to try and pin that down in 10,000 words was very bold. But what I did realize was that much of the existing discourse focused on the idea of silencing and exclusion, and so it ended up being a reframing of this using Fricke's framework. And then as I began to look at arguments which have been relied on against the permissibility of the veil, which are often rooted in feminist liberatory discourse, the testimonial injustice that was at play began to be a lot more tangible to see. So yeah, I guess then that my original contribution, I hope, is that this debate and this discourse has not yet been framed specifically as epistemic injustice in post-colonial or feminist post-colonial studies, and it hasn't yet been used as a case study in the philosophical field of epistemic injustice. So, sorry, I haven't had time to go into a lot of things or sources, and I hope that makes some sense, but I do just want to conclude by saying that with more and more countries choosing to ban the veil and its intensification as a politicized symbol, and the body of a veiled woman being this political playground, still, there has never been a more critical time to break down the epistemological underpinnings of the debate and not just the geopolitical and historical factors that have led up to it. Yeah. Should I say something about my motivation?
Yeah, I think that would be lovely.
Oh, sorry, I can hear you. What was that, sorry?
Yes, please.
As for my motivation, I think it started as an interest and a fascination, because I have my pathway is philosophy, and I've never really done kind of post-colonial studies or like religious studies like this. And I had this really interesting lecture on my year abroad in Montreal last year with a professor called Ali Al-Siji, who spoke about the veil. And she said that it was representative of not just Western representations and depictions of what we think how we perceive Muslim women to be, but it also functions as a negative mirror by which Western feminism is constructed. And I remember hearing this and something just clicked in my brain. I thought that's really interesting. And this is actually, now I know, a really frequently noted idea, like this idea of objection has been, or it has a very rich discursive history, like going back to Orientalism with Said, who says that the West doesn't just construct the East, but it uses it to construct itself. So that has been quite a nice thing to follow throughout. Yeah, so it started with that fascination. And I think originally I also, and now looking back, I feel like it's quite a superficial tie. I wanted to link it to COVID masking and the changing semiotic landscape, but there's a lot of nuances and complexities in the debate that just made this a difficult road to go down. So I didn't in the end. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. And I'm sure that we'll have some questions, so stay tuned. Why don't we have Katreya next, just to make sure we'll have enough time for everyone, but I know Katreya has to leave a bit early, so let's make sure she's in there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've got a work thing. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with my motivation first, because that sort of is what makes sense to me. The closest thing I got to a year abroad was a research trip to Manchester in February of 2020, which now seems very risky, actually, that I went that far. But I was in the Labour Party archives, which is like a huge collection of lots of things to do with the Labour Party and from the Labour Party themselves, from like their official documents. And I did a research project for a history unit about the treatment of women in Labour Party publications by men, and how a male feminist, or a man who presented himself as being for women's liberation at the time, was feminized and presented in a really negative way by the male press of the Labour Party. And so that got me thinking, like, how do these women fit in the national idea of sort of women in politics on the left, in a wider sense? And so that got me thinking, and Labour is one of the only main parties to have not had a woman leader. And I wanted to know what the motivations were behind that, and why a woman hasn't been able to gain the popularity within and without of her party to become the Labour leader. And obviously there have been some that have tried, but they have not succeeded. And so I went down this path, which really combines political science, history, a little bit of English analysis in what the newspapers say, and some cultural studies analysis of what it means to be a political celebrity and how that is gendered in Labour Party politics, and the British press presentations of Labour Party politics. So I've used 3 case studies to do this. I'm using Ellen Wilkinson, who was an MP from 1924 to her death in 1947. Barbara Castle, who was an MP for much of the, she was an MP from the 1940s right up to 1979, when she left to become a member of the European Parliament. And Mo Mowlam, who was instrumental, she was one of Blair's babes in 1997, which was a big group of women that came into the House alongside Tony Blair. But she was instrumental in the peace process in Northern Ireland, and she played a huge part there. And so all 3 of these women have so much in common. One of them is the way that the press presents them, but I wanted to frame this in a way that hasn't been done before, because Ellen Wilkinson's had some work done on her life. There's a lot of work on interwar period women in Parliament, because they were the first women to be there. And so they're just a really interesting case study generally, because they were the first women allowed into this space. But actually, the year that Barbara Castle left Westminster to become an MEP was the first year that Mo Mowlam tried to become an MP, but her local party refused to put forward a woman candidate. They would actually rather have a man who was further left-wing than they thought was acceptable as their local party be their nominee for that seat, rather than Mo, because the last woman they had had in power in their area was Ellen Wilkinson. So there's that really nice connection there. Actually, Ellen Wilkinson was really far left for the Labour Party as you imagine it now. So it's quite interesting to see how that dynamic works too. But essentially, the way in which I framed it is that these periods in which women MPs are especially treated poorly by the press, or treated in a very gendered way, fall in line with when feminist waves occur. So the first wave of feminism, obviously suffragettes, allowed women into Parliament. So that sort of, Ellen Wilkinson comes in after that, and there's a lot of progression in getting the vote for more women, because obviously not everyone was enfranchised at the same time. But there's nothing to really grasp onto after that suffragette movement. There's no first wave feminist like extensions of what they want. So actually she's in this sort of limbo where there's not much resistance to women's liberation because it's already happened in their eyes. So she can manipulate the press how she wants because she's not fighting for something that there's resistance to. Whereas when you get to Barbara Castle, there's such a resistance to the second wave feminist women's lib movement that she has to create all of these dualities. She has to be a woman for the women she's talking to, but a man in politics, and the politics as male framework comes in. She has to present masculinely and code her language in a certain way. But then she also plays on the fact that she, like, there's articles where she's like, I haven't styled my hair, so I've put a hat on. So there is still that feminine touch. And then with Mo Mowlam, a lot of what the press was talking about was controlled by spin and by spin doctors. And so actually she was martyred quite often for her party because she was a likable woman. They used her to give bad news and to be sort of this idol, but at the same time she was such a threat to Tony Blair that they couldn't allow her to get any higher. And it actually comes in with all of the third wave feminist ideas about like workplace equality and the littler things, not the sort of big systematic change, the sort of smaller things. So it actually maps really like closely together, and it really affects how they're presented. And so that all comes together in what was supposed to be a really cool piece of research, but it hasn't quite worked out. So I reached out to a lot of current Labour MPs for comment and to ask them which Labour women inspired them, because I'd love to know if they think of Ellen Wilkinson, if they evoke her, and to talk about how they feel the press have gendered them and what that means, and whether actually their race or any disabilities they have or their class actually they feel come into it more than their gender. But actually I've only had 2 responses, one of which means that I'm having a meeting after the original dissertation deadline, so I've got an extension so that I can meet with one woman in case she says anything interesting, because I think that's part of it, is if your research doesn't go quite as planned, you may still get a really cool quote out of it that like works with what you're saying. So it actually means that my conclusion paragraph is no longer look at what the women are saying now, but it's actually how it's become like a full circle. Ellen Wilkinson had a lot of control over her own image because she used her femininity to gain popularity, and then she could use that popularity to put in her political ideas. And now women MPs use their own social media to present an image of themselves that then they can use to amplify their political sort of leanings. And that sort of explores how people like Jess Phillips, anytime she speaks in the House, it's for a soundbite that could be used very effectively. And a couple of weeks ago, she invoked Ellen Wilkinson to tell Matt Hancock off because Ellen Wilkinson stood down from a role because of a tiny little misdemeanor, but Matt Hancock's still in his job. So that sort of covers all of it. I think the interdisciplinarity is that it's like political, historical, a little bit of English, quite cultural. I'm not sure if I've missed anything. I may have done.
That's great, thank you. Super interesting. Jess Phillips is in my area here in Birmingham.
Oh, nice.
I'm a fan. That was really interesting, and I'm already seeing a thread. I'm seeing connections that we can get to when we get to the questions. So Ed, why don't you tell us about your project, and then we can think kind of more globally.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So I am writing my topic. I'll say the title because that's probably the best way to describe it. So the title is The Vicious Cycle of Masculinity, How Masculinity Thrives in Society by Negatively Manifesting Itself in Advertising. So what my argument is I'm exploring how outdated roles, norms and stereotypes of the male sex role are still present in society because advertising is enforcing them for their own capitalist needs. So kind of the breakdown of it is I need to remember the names now. Brannon and David, can't remember, Robert Brannon and Deborah David, they came up with 4 roles of masculinity. And these roles they titled No Sissy Stuff, The Big Wheel, The Sturdy Oak, and Give 'em Hell. So each one, whilst there's a big crossover between all of these norms and stereotypes, they kind of focus on more distinct elements. So No Sissy Stuff sees masculinity as the rejection of femininity. And there was a quote which is, masculinity is what one is not rather than who one is, which plays into the big wheel, which is about this hierarchy within masculinity and how the hegemonic male is at the top, and the hegemonic male is usually, obviously you have a hegemonic male in different masculinities, but at the top of masculinity, it's middle class, white and straight, usually. And then the sturdy oak is this whole idea that men should not show vulnerability or emotional expressiveness. And then finally, Give 'em Hell is about violence and aggression. So the first chapter explores that in society and how it manifests itself. But then to support that, I look at individual advertisements, more modern. And this was probably my greatest difficulty, because you kind of, when you think of sexist and traditional gender roles in advertising, you think probably back to kind of the Mad Men era. But when a bit more research was done, it's actually crazy how much it's still like, it's so much more subtle, and therefore it's approved by society and then becomes an accepted belief within society. So I relay those exact sexual norms and stereotypes into the adverts. So for the rejection of femininity, I compare men's health and women's health, and how in the adverts in these magazines, and how femininity is portrayed as through appearance within the intersection of health, and then masculinity is portrayed as kind of physical strength and performance, which is used as a false justification of the patriarchy. And for example, a random stat is that in Men's Health, the latest edition, there were 15 workouts alongside advertised supplements and food, whereas in Women's Health, there were only 3. So Women's Health is much more centered around lifestyle, whereas Men's Health is more fitness. And similarly, in these adverts, I then look at GQ, Gentleman's Quarterly, and a lot of the adverts within Men's Health and Lifestyle magazines are advertising expensive clothing or watches, which is used as, for the hegemonic male, as kind of a sense of status. So it's highlighting this idea that money, if you have money, you can be a true man. And obviously this vicious cycle starts to see, because if a coat is £3,000, that's excluding a lot of people from buying that coat, and therefore allowing the hegemonic male, who's the capable earner, of buying these things to fuel his status, and therefore fueling the advertising, the success of the adverts. So, and then comparing, again, looking at women's magazines, I compared the Women's Health to GQ, and the most expensive item of clothing on Women's Health was a jacket, which was priced at £215, and then in GQ, there was a coat which was priced at £2,910. So it's highlighting this idea, which I speak about in the Sturdy Oak, how in a heteronormative nuclear family, the man is considered to be the breadwinner and the supporter of the family, whereas the mother is considered to be the one to look after the children and for the children to express their emotions to, which also goes into the study of why men don't express emotions, etc. And then I go kind of back to this idea of the physical strength and look at the mental health connotations with it, and how these idealized visions of men in underwear, swimwear adverts, or fitness magazines are these godlike figures, which is unattainable by most people, or extremely difficult to reach that level. And there's this whole idea that it creates this false reality, and then people don't think they're worthy of being a true man if they can't represent this physical perfection. And then finally, the one I've done most recently, which I struggled with at first, because it's about kind of the violence and sexual dominance within adverts. And whilst back in 2007, Dolce & Gabbana had an advert where a topless man, pinned down a woman while 3 other men stood by and watched. There wasn't, it's mad. I mean, it's not obviously super recent, but it's 14 years ago. So I found an advert last year by Dior, which represents Robert Pattinson, and whilst the image of women within these male-orientated adverts has changed, they're now presented as these desiring, sexualized beings, and therefore it kind of gives the impression to the audience that man has the right to dominate women sexually, and obviously the negative connotations with that, which we've seen recently, and how the given how status comes into the sexual dominance and doesn't promote, that conveys the message which is now approved in society, but because it's so subtle that it's still present. And I mean, I've just kind of flicked through my writing as I've gone by, but I mean, I guess the motivation kind of came primarily from the mental health aspect, and about how men can't, well, are encouraged, well, not encouraged, but encouraged to not talk, conceal their emotion, and then when they do speak about emotion, I asked a few of my guy friends, saying, who do you speak to if you need to? And they don't speak to their other guy friends, they always usually speak to girls, because of this whole idea of the heteronormative nuclear family, and how the woman is the person that the children express emotion to. So there's so much, and I mean, I wish I could go more into it, but I feel like we'd be here all day. So that's kind of the idea behind it.
Wonderful, thank you. Those were very interesting, and I love the threads that bring them together. I've probably told some of you this, but when I started teaching, which was when I was a postgrad, I was a master's student 2 decades ago, my students all told me that there was no need for feminism anymore, that there was no such thing, the idea of the patriarchy that I had was very old-fashioned, and that I was out of date. Now, keep in mind, I was only about 4 or 5 years older than my students, right? But even that gap, they said, was enough to make me completely out of touch, and that this was just a really outdated idea, this idea that we still need feminism. So I was just thinking about that yet again as I heard all of you speak, because obviously there's a really interesting thread about gender going through all of these gender norms, both for men and for women, and for women who are cast in male terms, for men who are cast in female terms, etc. There's so much that's still going on, yeah. So that really struck a chord with me, and I do think about that a whole lot. When I was very little, there was a record, you know, records. There was a record that we used to have in my house called Free to Be You and Me. And we used to listen to it over and over. And it's a bunch of very famous people, actually, from the 70s, who got together and created this. It was an album, but it was also sort of a puppet show-ish, strange film that was very, very popular. And the whole, I mean, now it'll seem outdated for other reasons, sort of. It's an idea of feminism that's very second wave in many ways, and doesn't have some of the ideas that are more current. But the basic theme of it is that, you know, boys and girls are, there's all these different songs like, they're tearing down girl land, and girl land is full of girls who like have to wear gloves and make sure their skirts are neat, and they're not allowed to climb trees, and that's it, they're tearing down girl land, you know. Or the theme song Free to Be You and Me are free to be you and me, right? We don't have to conform to these gender norms. But that was when I was growing up, that was a big deal for me. And anyway, yes. So that was really wonderful. I really appreciated those 3 different, very different topics, but a really nice, consistent question. And so I guess I'm clearly using my chair's prerogative, and I'm going to, I guess, ask a question to you all based on what I'm blabbing on about, you know, do we still need, and I'm going to say feminism, but I also want to suggest that, especially thinking about Ed's case, you know, it's when I say feminism, I don't just mean for women, obviously, right? I'm thinking about something bigger than for women, but thinking about how does the patriarchy cripple everyone, right? How is it problematic across the board? What are different ways? So I just wonder if you guys could speak to how that played into your thinking about those questions of patriarchy, obviously in different ways. Anyone is welcome to speak first. Just turn on.
Yeah. So actually, my conclusion focuses on like this idea of fourth wave feminism that we're sort of in now, and obviously because you categorize things once you're sort of through them or in the middle of them. But fourth wave feminism started roughly in 2012, and it's that real intersectional focus and bringing in the people that rich white feminism forgot. And I think what it is necessary is actually bringing men on board now, and bringing people who like Ed, your research is like about how the patriarchy hurts mental health. Like that's the need for feminism, is that actually it's really affecting everyone, and it's one of these big structures that needs to be tackled, and it's really linked to other big structures like white supremacy and capitalism. They're all linked and they all have really like detrimental effects. And so to like move forward, there still needs to be that focus on how patriarchy as well as other big systems inform our society. Please, someone else.
I feel like, Karen, what you're kind of saying earlier with how people think it's outdated, and kind of what I was focusing on with the gender roles in general. If you look up something as simple as synonyms of feminine online, it comes up with weak, it comes up with vulnerable, it comes up with powerless, and then masculinity is the opposite, which is just in order to kind of break this with feminism. I think the gender roles need to kind of intertwine together and become more androgynous and more inclusive, because otherwise so many people are ostracized. Like, the gender roles are a complete social construct, and I highlighted this in one paragraph about trans people, and how this gender crossing highlights the fragility of these gender roles, which are socially constructed. So yeah, I mean, feminism is kind of this. I think feminism is only the start, and I think it needs to evolve a lot more. But then one of my questions, playing devil's advocate, is if we keep on breaking down these gender roles, are we breaking down identity as well? Is it a form of identity, or is it a form of, like, is it a role in society? I think that's the question that always needs to be asked. The roles need to probably be broken down, but the identity can maybe stay. But I don't know.
I just wanted to quickly say, I think what's really interesting about, oh, can you guys hear me? Yeah. I think what's really interesting about what Ed's doing is every time that I hear people talk about feminism, it's always from like a female perspective, and people are always talking about, you know, like the struggles that like women go through and how that kind of affects them as their role in society. But I guess, and I feel like almost naive even admitting this, but I'm just really glad that Ed's kind of brought this up for me, is just that I've never really thought about how much the patriarchy will affect men, and the pressure of having to be that breadwinner and having to be strong and having to be all of these things. And it almost just like flips it on its head in a way. And it's just really refreshing to hear that, especially in terms of mental health. I think it's really, really important, and especially like male mental health, which you definitely touched on, Ed, but I just think it's a really interesting discussion.
I agree. This is a bit off topic to what Ed was saying, and I don't want to go away from it because that was really interesting. But I would just say, regarding Karen, your question, that my analysis does quite heavily rely on a deconstruction of what we consider Western feminism and white feminism to be, and that the playing out of implicit boundaries between sexually repressed and sexually liberated and covered and uncovered is a notion that has gained sustenance from contemporary Western constructions of bodily display and sexual expressivity. And there's actually quite an interesting example used by a few scholars, which is the Sex and the City example, which basically says that while feminism may have addressed the struggles that women face in formulating their sexual desires, the simplistic equation between bodily display and sexual expressiveness has been capitalized on by consumerism. So with Sex and the City, there's this constructed synergy of open, visible, white, glamorous, youthful female bodies that can freely express their sexual self-assertion and desire. But then the irony is that this open and natural body is often constructed through strict regimes of internalized management, like dieting or wearing makeup or plastic surgery. And it's masked by this Western fetishization of choice as a confirmation of liberation and agency. So in that sense, just to go back to your question, I think it's feminism is still something that we should be working to deconstruct. I don't know if that answers it. Sorry.
I think that's great. I mean, I love the range of answers, and I think that it's just a really important conversation that we're having. I just learned last week that many countries, maybe this one too, have different retirement ages for men and women, that it's actually the norm around the world, and that some countries are working to close the gap. I think I read Austria is hoping to close the gap by 2030. And I just thought, why is it taking a decade? Why can't they just say, okay, both ages, both genders have a retirement age of? It was so shocking to me, but it goes back to, Ed, what you're saying about this idea of men as breadwinners. It's not gone, right? It's still there, and it's there and encoded in law. But anyway, let's see if other people have some questions. Again, either for individuals or across. Amy has raised her hand.
I have. Thanks, everyone. I think what really strikes me, having worked elsewhere in the university, generally with liberal arts students, is how engaged, how you connect your research to kind of real world issues that we're kind of facing today as a society, as a country, as women, as men, etc. And I wondered whether, when you were scoping out your dissertation topics, that was something that you explicitly wanted to do. Did you want to address like something that is, affecting your lives today? And connected to that, whether you foresee using this research anywhere beyond your dissertations. Do you think that maybe you haven't got to thinking about that yet, and one step at a time, but maybe beyond the dissertation deadline, do you think that there's a place for this research in, I don't know, pitching it to newspapers or magazines or anything like that? Because it seems like something that is, all these topics that are coming up are just so interesting to a kind of wider audience than just purely your supervisors or the teaching team.
I'll go first if you guys want to. But yeah, I mean, mine definitely kind of stemmed from contemporary stuff. Like, I wouldn't say I'm a pretty macho masculine man. I'd say I'm pretty camp, if anything. But these roles that kind of stigmatized against it. And again, with the mental health stuff, I think that's really important to raise and to battle. Like, obviously, me discussing masculinity is not just focusing on poor men. It's nothing to do with that. It's kind of how it affects the whole of society, and that's why it needs to be broken down. I mean, carrying it on afterwards, I don't know if academically I will, but I definitely, I'm partly looking jobs in advertising afterwards. So hopefully that will be quite useful to kind of spot these things and be like, actually, no, we need to make this more androgynous, more inclusive, rather than just depicting a minority throughout. So yeah, I mean, if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, totally. I think I mean, what an amazing thing to be able to talk about in a job interview, for example, like you've got direct research experience. I suppose I'm not trying to pry on people's personal connections to their research. I mean, more kind of, yeah, you don't have to share personal details, but just do you guys see a connection between your chance to do this research and sort of political activism, I suppose is my question. But
I can jump in, I guess. Actually, a lot of what caused me to even do the first piece of research was that I was feeling really disillusioned with the Labour Party. They should be my sort of political base in UK elections, not in Welsh elections. But they're not at the moment. I don't know who to vote for if we had a snap general election, because I was feeling really unhappy with them. And I think that sort of bred this feeling of I want to find out about where the party's been, where it could be going, and how that fits with things that I actually associate myself with. So I'm comfortable in my identity as a feminist, but I wouldn't be comfortable in an identity as a Labour voter currently. So I was really trying to understand that. And in terms of bringing it forward, I'm not sure I'd approach anyone to publish this. But if I were to do a master's, it would likely be in politics and like a social science. And I would just love to write exclusively about Mo Mowlam. She is such an interesting woman. She literally almost got killed by Ted Bundy. That's how interesting her life was. Like, she's amazing. So yeah, I need to do something else with this information that I have. So.
So yeah, just in relation to the first thing about whether it was linked to things going on, I think that it definitely was. I think it would be silly to say that it wasn't. As I arrived in Montreal in my year abroad, I was kind of met with contention about their proposed Bill 21, which was banning facial coverings. And that was quite a defining part of my first term. And then as I was leaving, obviously masked, crying into it, I think the irony really struck me, and it really sunk in how powerful this signifier was. So I think that definitely impacted it. In terms of like future work, I think I'm not sure about that, but I think in my day-to-day, doing the framework of epistemic injustice has been really enriching. So like I was thinking just yesterday how the term mansplaining actually constitutes a form of hermeneutical justice, because it's provided us with this conceptual resource which people have just been able to attach experiences to. So I think what I would say is that it has just at this stage been really beneficial to just start noticing things in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, Emma.
Thank you guys for some really fascinating talks, and the conversation ongoing is really interesting as well. I also truly believe that conversations around feminism and deconstructing it are at the forefront of the most important forms of activism at the moment. So it's really good to see it running through your work. I actually have questions for all of you individually about your work, but I'm going to start with Katrea because I know you have to go soon. So I'm also a massive fan of Mo Mowlam and grew up with her kind of in the background in Ireland. And I guess I was thinking about how her intervention in Northern Ireland and her role there, it was really a role in a space that is incredibly indelibly masculine. And I guess I was wondering if you thought about that context of her kind of, political journey with regards to the gender biases already embedded within the Labour Party.
Yeah, so a lot of what she was doing, like, she was an incredible person and like very good at her job, but a lot of what she brought were like the more feminine leadership qualities, and she would probably hate it if you described it as that. She didn't really like being put on like the women's side of things, but a lot of what she did was work with compromises and work with emotional intelligence and working out the relationships in the room. And so actually within the like masculine framework of the Labour Party and within the masculine framework of the politicians she was working with in Ireland and Northern Ireland, actually I think what enabled her to help so much was that sense of collaboration and compromise she brought, because whenever you hear her talk about the Northern Irish issues and the Irish issues, she is always like, but it's not just me, it's all of these brilliant politicians that are happy to compromise. And I think if it was a male politician, he may have taken a lot more credit and said, yeah, I did that. I was the minister who brought that about. So actually, yeah, within the frameworks, it's her difference that actually enabled her to do some really good work. So I think that's a really interesting part of my research, and how that's presented, and whether it's presented as the fact that she was a woman who could help, which it rarely was. Yeah, that's the real interest. So yeah, thank you for asking.
No problem, thank you. Your project sounds fascinating, and I encourage you to go down that Mulholland route if you get a chance at some point. And then I guess for Ed and Katie, Ed, I was thinking about the question of abuse and the allegations against Johnny Depp with regards to the Sauvage Dior campaign, and kind of whether you picked up on that with regards to this like toxic masculinity and its attachment to certain particular forms or tropes of advertising. Yeah, I thought that kind of I just remember that while you were speaking. I think it's a really interesting example of what you're talking about. And then Katie, I kind of guess I had a few questions, but I'm going to try and boil it down. I was wondering whether your project links into anything decolonial or decolonial theory more generally, or ideas around that, because epistemic injustice is also kind of attached to those areas. And then I guess I was wondering how you kind of have thought about measuring what you described as affordances of credibility. So I guess I was interested in how like that comes a process of data collection, or kind of how do you kind of contextualize that or express that in your work, and whether that relies on like already completed studies and therefore you're kind of engaging with their own biases and stuff, or how do you go about that? And I'll stop there. Thank you guys.
Do you want to go first, Katie, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I can try. In terms of decolonial studies and kind of discourse theory as it is, that is the original route I was going down. But there has been a lot said in this field. It generally talks about the discursive exclusion and representation of veiled subjectivities in Muslim women. And that is something that I think is very valid, and it's very there, it's still alive. Like representations of the veil is still loaded with that kind of Orientalist import. But I think what I found and what made me shift to it being specifically epistemic injustice is that there has been a shift, and whereas before they would be kind of discursively excluded, and maybe 20 years ago they were the voices were literally excluded, as in there are some scholars that talk about examples of TV panels and debates where they literally have no Muslim women on the panel. There is this kind of literal exclusion. I think what's happening more recently is that they are not being literally excluded from the conversation or the discourse, but what they are saying is not being heard. It's not on the speaker, it's now on the listener. And I think that's the subtle shift for me, if that makes any sense. So I've got one of my sources is a televised TV debate that was aired on Channel 4. And it's by the commentator Douglas Murray and Shia Lit, who was, she's a doctor who observes the niqab. And she is expressing repeatedly and eloquently that her reasons for wearing it are nothing to do with men or the patriarchal violence of Islam. And he hears that, she's present in the conversation and she's using her voice, and he is hearing that, but then the way that he subtly directs the conversation or asks other questions shows a blatant disregard of what she is actually saying. And there's this, what I think is a deficit of credibility there. Similarly, I have a classroom account from last year from the Religious Association Journal, and it's a description or a transcript of a student explaining why she wears the hijab, and then other classmates kind of talking over her. And even though she is there and she is expressing that, I think when you look at the dynamics of the conversation, what is really apparent is that her testimony is just not being afforded credibility. And it's not a radical thing that is being said, but I think that reframing it in this way is really important, and it kind of puts the burden away from who's speaking onto the listener, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think it's a really important flipping of the situation. I also think it's interesting to think about it in terms of a devaluation of the credible when it's associated with certain subjects as well. But anyway, thank you for that. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, I haven't looked at that, but that is a really good point to include, because it kind of highlights, like all of these adverts, by getting someone who's obviously, it makes sense because companies want to sell their products and stuff, by getting a famous figure to kind of be the face of the product. But by doing this, again, it kind of heightens this idea that to be a man, you need to be successful, you need to be an earner. So by having famous actors, and obviously having Johnny Depp, you kind of reinforce and kind of okay these things, and you're not promoting it, but you're kind of accepting it as just something that happens. So that's actually a really good idea to add. So thank you for that.
I think we have to wrap up. Incidentally, Ed, the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking was, I don't know if you've watched those Killing Me Softly videos. Are you familiar with those? There's a whole series over several decades, which is about images of women in advertising. And anyway, they're very interesting, but I feel like your project is a really nice complement to them, right? Thinking about how men are depicted and structured and constructed within advertising. So I think you can find them all. I think you can just type it into Google, and I think they're all really easily available. But it's a really nice project that complements that project. Anyway, but I think we have to wrap up. But I love that. I thought like these were fantastic. They're so interesting. Amy and I were just saying, we texted each other, we have the best students like ever. We're very lucky. So thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. Bake a cake next week. Do a dance, an interpretive dance. You know what I'm saying? And we'll see you then. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, Karen. Well done, Katie.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.